Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Dana Suskind in support of Parent Nation and in conversation this evening with Elyssa Schmier. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open. We'll be sharing links to purchase Parent Nation from Literati throughout the event. You can interact with us at any time, however, using the Q&A feature of the webinar that's available at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit your questions whenever they come to you. Please submit them using the Q&A, and I will ask a selection of your questions at the conclusion of the conversation. And as a reminder, if you're watching us later on YouTube, you can always find links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You'll also see in the bottom right-hand corner of the video, a little typewriter subscribe button, which you can click on and be kept up to date with all of our at-home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are, of course, open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Dana Suskind, MD, is founder and co-director of the TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, director of the Pediatric Cochlear Implant Program, and professor of surgery and pediatrics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Suskind is the author of over 45 scientific publications and 30 million words, Building a Child's Brain. She's a member of the American Academic of Pediatrics and a fellow for the Council on Early Childhood. Her work has been profiled by numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, The Economist, Forbes, NPR, and Freakonomics. Speaking with her this evening, Elyssa Schmier is the Vice President of Government Relations and National Budget for MomsRising. Her career is focused on legislative and policy work in the field of poverty policy. She previously served as Deputy Policy Director for the Jewish Council of Public Affairs and as a legislative representative for the Association of Community Organizations, for Reform Now. Elyssa has also worked in Senator Edward Kennedy's office, as well as Representative John Tierney's office. She received her bachelor's degree from Hobart and William Smith Colleges and her master's degree in government at Johns Hopkins University. Originally from Saumscott, Massachusetts, Elyssa now resides in Huntington Woods, Michigan, with her husband, son, and corgi. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dana Suskind and Elyssa Schmier into your living rooms.
Thank you so much. Hi, Dana. How are you doing tonight?
I'm great. I'm so glad you're here with me.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. First of all, I want to give you a huge congrats on this book. It's quite the accomplishment. I know that you have given birth to 3 children, and I think you have 8 total, and 1 book before this. So this gets, if you include your books, it's kind of like you have 10 kids altogether, because the birthing process of a book is quite impressive. And I think our audience will find that it's a wonderful read. Parent Nation, I find, combines science and research and personal stories, both your own, but also those of parents that you interviewed. And I think it's the type of motivation that parents need to not only care for their children, but also push them into the space to encourage policymakers and businesses to center our families collectively, which is so important at this particular time in our history. So can you share with us a little bit about why you decided to write this book as a follow-up to your first book, 30 Million Words, and how your goals this time around were a little different?
Absolutely. But I want to start off by saying that giving birth to a book is a little bit more painful than a child. At the end of a child, you have a little child to look at, but I feel very good at both. I wrote, just to contextualize things, I'm a pediatric physician, a pediatric implant surgeon. And, I went into medicine because I wanted to give every child a chance to reach their potentials. And as a cochlear implant surgeon, that meant allowing their children to learn to listen and learn to learn. And it was really the experience of seeing disparities in outcomes that led me on this journey to understand how important the first 3 years of life are, the power of parents to build their children's brains. And that is really the focus of the research that I do at the university and the center that I run. And I initially wrote 30 million words because I thought, gosh, if this powerful brain science was compelling enough for me as a surgeon to, step outside the operating room and really share it with families and be compelled by it. Well, certainly by writing a book called, a book that shared this powerful brain science with all families, that not only would they be able to understand how important it was, but importantly, maybe it would lead to structural changes in our country, because the brain science is just incredible. So I thought I would write this book. Parents would have the power within their hands of the science, and they could put it in action with their children, and there would be structural changes. Well, I can tell you, parents embraced the book and the knowledge, but it didn't lead to structural changes in our country. As we can tell, the societal shifts haven't happened. And since COVID-19, it is so clear that parents have been marginalized or sidelined, and they're struggling. And I thought, you know what? If this powerful brain science can be used at the individual level, maybe that same brain science can help inform a society that truly puts the needs of children and families at the center, and could inform our policies. We didn't need another parenting book, but I thought that this book, Parent Nation, could help us lead to a society that really aligns with, our values of putting families and children at the center.
Yeah, definitely. And I, I'm interested to hear how you kind of take the neuro and social science and research that you've done, for so many years, about the brain and about, the importance of what you do in the first 3 years with the child, and how that kind of informs those structural changes of policy that we should be passing to lift up, our children and all the families in this country. How does kind of brain and social science lead to public policy?
Yeah, no, it's quite amazing. And that's basically the foundation of the book. Neuroscience, I think, can give us a roadmap to how to create a society where, children and families are valued. And it tells us to prioritize, it tells us, just as what we need to prioritize individually, what we need to prioritize societally. And what does it tell us? Neuroscience tells us that we must begin when learning begins, not on the first day of school, but the first day of life. And it tells us that children's earliest and most impactful brain architects are their parents and caregivers. And it tells us that environment matters. Stable, calm environment fosters socio-emotional and executive function skills, whereas disruptive environment impedes the development. And so this sort of structure can then allow you to understand why certain policies are so aligned with the neuroscience. So something like paid family and medical leave. Do you want me to continue on to sort of give an example? So now that you have that framework, you can understand why paid family and medical leave is aligned with the neuroscience. There's a lot of research showing that paid leave, is focusing on the economics that positively impacts household income, employers, maternal mental health, father's involvement, et cetera, et cetera. But there's powerful research to show that it actually impacts the early brain development of children. So psychologist Natalie Brito and her colleagues at NYU recently published a paper where she looked at babies born to mothers with paid parental leave and those without. And long and short of it, those children born to parents with paid leave had sort of stronger neural brainwave function, if you will. And, in trying to, it wasn't a randomized control trial, but it was a correlational. But with that being said, what it showed was that they think that the mechanism that it worked through was maternal stress because they checked cortisol levels in the hair. So, all of these policies we often look at from an economic standpoint, which is really important, employer standpoint, et cetera. But really, at the end of the day, it impacts children's development.
That's so interesting. One of the pieces that I was really drawn to in the book, that was kind of a thread that pops up in different ways, is this mythic idea of American individualism that you talk about, and how we tell these stories of the original colonies and the Western pioneers as if everyone achieved what they achieved and they did it alone, and how this continues throughout American history to inform the policies and societal norms, and that this heavily impacts how parents perform and how they act, and the policies that are created for them. And when parents aren't necessarily aware of that, but they speak to this issue in the struggles that they talk about. And one mom in the book talks about how time consuming it is to apply for government support and how she felt judged every step of the way. And this is something in the work that I've done at MomsRising, a dialogue that I'm often hearing is kind of the judgment that they make on themselves and feel others make on them. And it's obviously untrue. And it's we don't do things alone. We have family and neighbors and teachers and community and support. But our policies as it act kind of as if that's not the norm. And so it makes it harder in America than, say, Europe, to have universal programs like universal paid leave and universal pre-K, even though everything from the economic outcomes to the brain waves in a child's head is kind of proven that this is the policies that we should be passing. And in the book, Cynthia Osborne is quoted as saying, we need care for the caregivers so they can care for the children. But this American individualism is mixed with a distrust of adults. And I kind of personally believe that that's built on racist and sexist notions. So can you speak to this issue? Because I found that really interesting and kind of eye-opening. I hadn't really thought about the American individualism, and how you think we can kind of find our way out of this so we can create a society that values families more and allows us to kind of pass the policies that we really know families need in order to raise our children healthy.
Absolutely. Thinking about why is it that we as a country are such an outlier compared to almost any other developed nation in terms of the supports for children and families. And, one common theme, as you mentioned, is this idea of American individualism, that you've got to be tough and independent and go it alone. And we have internalized this in the parenting space, and especially mothers have internalized this idea that it's an on your own, on your shoulder. It's all on your own as parenting, and that asking for help in some way is showing signs of weakness. And, I think one of the few sort of silver linings of COVID is that, it has shown a light that none of us parent alone, right? And the fact of the matter is that we are going to need to address this issue, because if we don't feel worthy as individuals, if we feel, one mother, in addition to the mother that you talked about, another mother, Talia, who is actually a PhD at the University of Chicago, who had to step back from the workforce because she couldn't afford childcare. She said, I felt like I was failing in all parts of my life. She didn't say, why is the society failing me, that me as a highly educated PhD can't even afford childcare, but she was internalizing it. And I think one of the rationales for the book, and one of the major things that we're going to need to do, is really shift expectations. We're going to have individuals, parents, start realizing, look, only a parent can raise a child. Well, not only, but, a parent raises a child, but a village or a society supports that parent in that role. Mm-hmm. And we need to have people starting to see that as a reality, or we won't have people voting in ways that they want and they need, because I can tell you, even though people talk about bipartisan, beliefs in this, not bipartisan, that this is a polarized topic. The truth is I spoke to mothers and fathers from all different backgrounds, all racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, religious, political backgrounds. And when you ask them, if I give you a magic wand, what would your supports look like? And you remove the political, right? And it all looks pretty much the same. So we need to sort of get us to the point of realizing that support gives us choice as parents. Right now, we're not given choices.
Yeah. And you touched upon COVID, because I think that's, kind of, ground shift moment in terms of how parents are viewed and kind of what happened in this country during the height of the pandemic, and what potentially could happen in the aftermath in a way that we hadn't really seen in decades, in terms of parenting issues kind of being on the front page. And you started your research for this book, obviously, well before COVID, and some of the research you've been doing for years. But I'm interested in what your thoughts are and your hopes for this parent nation. And do they differ now, or do you think the needs are different 2 years kind of into the pandemic that has obviously made the inequalities in education and healthcare and childcare in particular much more visible to more people?
Yeah, so obviously I started thinking about the book before COVID, but I actually started writing the book at the beginning of COVID.
Okay.
And I guess we were all,
Right.
yeah, exactly, all 10 of us in the house. But, in some ways, it intensified my belief in the need for this, what needed to happen, and actually broaden the tent. Much of my work at the University of Chicago is working with incredible families, from the South Side of Chicago, living in poverty, facing the barriers that I was seeing them face, things like homelessness, unjust incarceration, 5 jobs without benefits, were made parenting impossible. And it was it was so overwhelming, because these were families that actually had come to our program to learn how to build their children's brains, and they embraced this idea and they were all in. And then I kept seeing society put huge barrier after barrier. And that was the impetus initially for writing the book. Like, gosh, this cannot be. And then COVID hit. And as you said, a light was shined, and you realize, wow, we make it impossible for certain parents to raise their children in this country, but we make it really hard on almost all parents. I mean, I don't think people realize just how different it is. I mean, forget about Norway and Finland, but any other country, we are so far behind. And so I made the decision that, they're powerful stories, as they're incredible stories that go throughout the book. I mean, the families are not just participants in our studies, they've become friends. They've shown us really what needs to happen in this country. But I decided to broaden who I spoke to. So, families from all different, socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. I mean, we have, a couple of mothers who are from the evangelical community whose desire were, their families had always stayed home and raised their children, and they couldn't because they had no health care and a living wage, and even political backgrounds. And because I wanted to tell the universal story, because at this moment in time, we are, polarized, and it is overwhelming. But the truth is that when you find the common thread of parents' love for their children, it is what binds us. And it is an opportunity, I think, that we've overlooked. So often when we all look at other parents, we don't actually think about parents as the first identity, and we don't think of it of ourselves either. We think of other identities, and it's what separates us. But I think if we found a way, and that's why I told all these stories, to build empathy and build community, we could potentially come together. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but I believe it.
No, I believe it too. In the book, you give a bunch of different examples of like policies that have worked at the local, even national level, how close we came at one point to having universal childcare, thanks to Richard Nixon, believe it or not, was like the closest we've ever come. We were within a heartbeat of having that as a norm. And you think about what it would be like to have had that for 50 years or something, and where our country would be.
You wouldn't be working for MomsRising, and I wouldn't have had to write this book.
Right. It would I think everything would change if we had that. But you also kind of use an example of seniors and the AARP and kind of those policies, along with you have a great piece on military childcare as an example, as a policy that works. But with the seniors, you talk about how they kind of created these policies, and a voting bloc kind of came out of that has historically swayed elections. And I'm wondering, there's a lot bubbling up politically to kind of fill this vacuum that, because we're lacking a parent nation right now, and that kind of mentality of like, I'm a parent voter type of thing. So I'm wondering what, those of us who are in the movement like me, what parents in general, people who are interested in these issues, what can we kind of borrow from that example of a senior voting bloc and the policies they were able to get out of that and kind of secure as like, the third rail politics, you don't touch Social Security.
You know what? Absolutely. And I have to tell you, in writing this book and just seeing this huge disconnect, I mean, it can be overwhelming. And so I wanted to look for a bright spot when huge sweeping changes have happened for a population, because I get the feeling we all sort of feel like, oh, we're stuck. I mean, are we ever going to move? And right. So the elderly is just such a powerful case because, half a century ago plus, the poorest, most underserved population wasn't children, because today children under 5 are the poorest. But back then it was the elderly. 50% lived below the minimum standards of decency. They were so impoverished. And really the AARP and really the gray lobby and the passage of Medicare and Social Security, which labor played a role, really helped transform what it is to be elderly in this country. The poverty rates fell by 70%. There's no age demographic better supported and with reason than the elderly. And what's very, another interesting point about them is that we always think about the elderly as the most politically active, right? They go and vote. Back then, they voted in lower numbers than the young. And my hypothesis, and I think there's a fair amount of research to show this, that in some ways, policy also helped create them as a bloc, right? Because all of a sudden, they started viewing themselves as politically important. Politicians started realizing they had to answer to them. And now when you say things like, get government's hands off my Social Security, we all smile, but it's because it is just expected. And I think that parents as a whole, we don't expect it. It's going back to that expectation. And for us to really push this forward, we have to elevate our expectations of society. We need to build a collective identity, because until we sort of feel as a whole, we're going to be, split in a million pieces and have no way to push forward. So I think the AARP is, I can go on and on. I've read so many, I'm an expert in the AARP. I love them. But that's enough to share tonight.
Yeah. And I think, right now we're at this very interesting moment because there actually is legislation moving in Congress. But this paradigm they kind of have us in is like, you can only choose one thing off your list, right? Like it's going to either be childcare or the extension of the child tax credit, which provides monthly checks to parents, or paid leave. Like you can only have one of these policies. We can't have, what we need, which is a comprehensive wraparound plan. And I kind of think about, another book that I read by Jeffrey Canada that talks about the Harlem Children's Zone, that talks about like how important it is to have schools and childcare have these wraparound services where you start when the baby's in utero and you take them all the way through the first couple of years of school, and how you have to have, that a parent doesn't just rely on, say, food stamps. They need, paid leave, they need paid sick days, they need a livable wage. So if you are kind of making that argument to, say, a senator, maybe, I don't know, a senator from West Virginia or something like that, for example, how would you talk about this from your research point of view of why it's not just one thing, that the parents that you've talked about kind of have these different moments in the lives of their young children and the needs that they have, kind of across the income spectrum?
Yeah, no. And I want to couch it first that, by putting forth this pathway or framework forward, it is a way to allow us not to silo. I think what happens is that groups internally get, not pitted against each other. It's like, is it a paid leave thing? Is it a childcare thing? Mm-hmm. And we lose the power of our collective. With that being said, obviously there is a pragmatism, right? If I had a magic wand, let me tell you, it'd look very different. But I do think, going back to the AARP, and then I'll answer your question, that they sort of chose their non-negotiables, right? Mm-hmm. Social Security and Medicare. And, obviously they continue to advocate for things like prescription drugs, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in some ways, choosing your three non-negotiables could be a way. I think that, and that's critical. What would my three non-negotiables be? I mean, certainly paid family and medical leave, high quality early childcare. Actually, I want 4. Let's
hear them.
I want portable benefits, which I know doesn't sound like a childcare issue, but I think family stability is critically important. And the child credit. Can I have those 4? Mm-hmm. Those would be my 4.
And go right ahead. That would be magical.
Well, this is what I would say. I would talk about the neuroscience framework, but I think what people often forget, they often say, oh, look at these huge price tags. How are we going to pay for it? But I say this. The beauty of investing in the early childhood space is that not only does it pay for itself, it is a negative cost, right? I mean, so I'll give you an example. Obviously everybody knows Nobel laureate Jim Heckman's work that every dollar invested in early childhood, you get $13 return on investment. And his office is just 2 floors down from mine, right? But the child credit that just lapsed, that was there for a year, that, lifted 3 million children out of poverty, that we know is bad for children's brain, that reached 61 million families, right? People said, look at that cost. But then, this powerful research came out that actually you get tenfold return on investment. So my big, unfortunately, in convincing people, I would convince them with the economic argument, the neuroscience argument. But you know what? I don't actually believe that we can convince them, right? What we need is a collective that they will feel obligated to respond to us, right? Because convincing has not gotten us anywhere. Everybody understands this. I am not buying that people don't get it. I'm buying that people are on a 4-year, election cycle, and they don't have a, lobbying block, even though parents and caregivers, there's so much invisible labor and, contribution to the GDP that they don't see, but they have nobody lobbying for them. So I believe that they know this. The only answer, how do you like this? I think the most powerful answer is that we need a collective, and they need to be able to answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think that any entry point that a parent can have into kind of making their voice heard and informing themselves, that like just the starting point of that is valued. So if voting is your entry point, then you need to vote. If attending a school board meeting is your entry point, then that's really important, all the way up to, you know, going up and talking to your member of Congress at a town hall meeting, you know, all of that kind of pieces. They really value the hearing from you aspect and how loud that voice is. And until the voice is collected, kind of like what you say with the parent nation, they're not going to hear it as loud. And that's, you know, that's what my work is all about.
Exactly. And just to clarify, parent nation isn't a thing. It's just, for me, parent nation is an ideal. It's an ideal of a society that values the labor and love of parents and caregivers. So Moms Rising and these groups are the action.
Well, let's talk about that a little, because, you know, you kind of plant the seed, but I think that this isn't just a book. You know, you and your team have created a website. You're working on putting the ideas that are in the book into motion. So what are kind of your next steps, your plans, now that the book is kind of out in the world? What are you hoping that you guys will be able to do over the next couple of years? What are you hoping your readers will kind of like take from your research and put into motion? What are you hoping the next step of this is?
Oh, goodness. So, you know, as you mentioned, if any of the listeners go on parentnation.org, there's a lot of free downloadable resources. And we've put together, I wouldn't say a curriculum, but a framework that groups can use. We're not leading it. We believe that this needs to be community driven, but we've got a curriculum that allows people to come together, to find community, forge collective identity, and fight for change. It's following my theory of change. And it's an amazing curriculum that really, I think, allows people to be community driven, think about the things that they want to see, you know, what positive change that they want to see in their own communities, whether it's fighting for a lactation, you know, room in the community center to, you know, I really want to be connected to a group that's fighting for childcare. Oh, look, Moms Rising, right? I mean, so it's really about connecting and starting to see themselves, you know, as not just their children's first and most important brain builders, but the guardians of our country's future, and starting to expect and demand support from society. So there's some really cool tools on there, but I know we don't have time to go over them. So
no, that's helpful. And I encourage everyone to check out the website and kind of play around on there. So I imagine that you get this, you know, it's like whenever you have someone like you at a dinner party, or, you know, someone sitting next to you on an airplane or something, besides asking their medical questions, once they find out kind of the books that you've written, I'm sure you get the question of like, what is the one or two things I should be doing? You know, I have an 8-month-old, so this might be a selfish question, but like, what are the few things that I should be doing from day one? Because you kind of said it begins at day one, to make sure that, you know, I'm raising my child to reach his fullest potential. You know, it seems so loaded and cheesy, but I'm sure you get this question all the time.
No, absolutely. So, but first, before I give people the secret magic formula, which I swear, when I wrote my first book, 30 million words, I think people thought that it was, you know, it will bring about, you know, world peace. I mean, it is pretty, but first I want you to give yourself grace, right? Parenting is hard. And you have to know that, you know, there's a lot riding on it, but there is something called good enough parenting. So none of us will be always perfect. We can only try to be the best that we can. And remember that, you know, I'll tell you what we do at the center. At the center, we've boiled down the science to a simple way to remember how to build your child's brain. It's the 3 T's: tune in, talk more, take turns. So tune into your child, follow your child's lead, look at what little Joey or Sammy is interested in, and really follow his lead. then talk about it using rich language. Talk about the past, the future, and the present, and then take turns. View your child as a conversational partner from day one. And you can use these 3 T's in everyday scenarios. Literally, if you are, walking the dog, folding laundry, reading a book, this is just a tool to really bump up your language and interaction with your child. And let me give you why it is. In those first 3 years of life, 85% of your baby's brain is developed. Every second, 1 million new neural connections are being formed. It's because our brains come out. So it's amazing. Our brains come out pretty underdeveloped. I mean, unlike our heart and lungs, they come out undercooked and need to be developed. And they're actually waiting for input from parents and caregivers. It is these few years of life are why humans are the smartest of all species. It's an evolutionary gift. So in some ways, I say that, when society doesn't invest in parents, they are squandering the universe's greatest evolutionary gift.
Mhm.
So when we push forward society, it's to ensure that all children can reach their potential. So
That's helpful. I know that, when I was into out of the abyss of my leave, when I came out of the second month and finally can come up for air or something, and then I had to fill the days right, with this child, and I'm like, after we've done tummy time and I've read to him and he took his nap and he fed, what the heck do we do? And one of my friends said, you do the tour of the house. You walk around and you say, this is the refrigerator. Inside the refrigerator, let's see what's inside. There's a window. Let's see what we see. She said it didn't matter what I was saying. It was just words.
just interacting.
Just interacting.
Although, I do, not only do I want parents to give themselves grace, but they're really, children do need time on their own. So you don't have to feel like you're talking all the time. I joke, we don't actually know the threshold that children need. So there is, so yes, you can give him a tour of the house, or you can let him play on his own in the bassinet.
Right. Eventually he'll say, okay, now shut up, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot, Mom.
Great.
So yeah, no, it's really not that complex. This sounds crazy, but when we say children, parents are children's brain architects, they really are. But what it takes isn't so hard, right? It's that nurturing interaction and protection from toxic stress. And it's just amazing that here there's this incredible thing that happens, in the development of a child, and we can't seem as a society to just recognize it and support parents and caregivers, in this important role. Yeah.
Totally. Well, I want to see, John, I wanted to check with you to see if there was any questions before we kind of see if Dana has any last words.
There's no questions yet. If you do have a question for Dana, please feel free to submit it in the Q&A. I'll be sure to ask it. But otherwise, Elyssa, yes, please, if you want to ask maybe one more question for our author this evening before we go.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to, go ahead.
Am I allowed to ask you about how MomsRising? Because I think that people would enjoy hearing about that.
Yeah, of course. So thank you for asking. So MomsRising is a national organization. We have 1 million members around the country. You don't need to be a mom to be a member. You could just, we always say, you could be a mom, you could support moms, you could have a mom, you could love a mom, that type of thing. But we're on the ground and online organizing, and our main goal is to create economic stability for moms, women, and children, and decrease discrimination. And so obviously that's a very lofty goal, but we do work on healthcare and a lot of these workplace justice works like paid leave and paid sick days and pregnancy discrimination. We work on immigration, childcare, tax issues, anything that kind of impacts moms, kids, and parents in the country. And we do a lot of collecting the stories of moms and their lived experience, because I think as you'll also see in the book, like you can have as much research and data as you want, but if it's absent of the real lived experience, then you're really missing something. And we've seen those stories impact how policies were actually written. You know, once members of Congress kind of gathered a couple of moms together and talked about, like, you know, how would you really use this policy? They realized, oh, this section is actually not workable at all. We need to rewrite it a little bit. So, you know, I think it's incredibly empowering to know that, you know, what you're going through and what you're struggling with as a parent, it might, you often think like, this is a personal failure. I'm unable to do this, and why can everyone else? But when you kind of start to talk to each other and gather together, you realize there's so many other parents that are going through what you're going through. And it's not a personal failure, it's a structural failure. And so that's what MomsRising is trying to address, is the structural failures that have, you know, harmed parents and children, and ways to kind of fix that. So we encourage everyone to kind of check us out. We're at www.momsrising.org.
It is such an important organization. I mean, really what you're talking about is what I heard over and over again. Mothers, you know, feeling like it was all on them, that they were failing, and thinking that in some ways other people had it figured out. And you know, that's
the secret is no one does.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, I'll tell you one last thing related to the website. We built this tool called the Big Shift tool, where we invite people to sort of look at, you know, for all these different childcare issues, whether it be, you know, taking their child to a doctor when they don't have any more days off, you know, who will they look to for help? Or they can't afford high quality childcare, where will they look for help? And basically we take them through this process to see how much is on their shoulders versus society and society's help. And then we invite them to say, look, going through the same scenarios, if you had a magic wand and you could create society, what would it look like? And what we found time and time again is that it becomes more balanced, that people, I don't think, realize how much is on their shoulders. I mean, they do at some level, but seeing it, you know, starkly like that really hits home, and it allows them to reimagine what a society would look like that is more balanced. And I think, you know, we need to get those stories out that MomsRising are doing, and, you know, get people elevating that expectation. So
I love that. That's so great. That's really helpful.
We do have one question, and I actually think it'd be a good question to ask on. A viewer, Sam, asks if each of you could name a time you might have needed a parent nation in your own lives.
Do you want me to go first, or would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Dana.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a very personal story. Back in 2012, when my children were quite young, I lost my first husband, who drowned in Lake Michigan, saving 2 children. And, you know, I thought, you know, my life crumbled underneath my feet. And I thought, God, what's going to happen to my children? What's going to happen to me? And, you know, at the moment in time when I felt like all was lost, really my community and my employer and, you know, city really wrapped themselves around me. And, you know, the truth is, you know, none of us, you know, go through life without a lot of, you know, stuff happening. And I really saw at that moment in time, I always say I lost my faith in serendipity, but I gained my faith in humanity. And, you know, we all deserve that sort of support. We all deserve support, because there are times, you know, economic shocks, life shocks, and we all deserve support, but it can't be left, you know, up to serendipity, you know, oh goodness, sorry. You know, really what policies do, what social norms, what's, you know, community does is by putting it into structure, you take away the uncertainty of it. And so that is when I needed a parent nation. It was there for me. And I want every family to have it, because every family loves their kids and every family deserves it. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dana. I think for me, you know, I I just had my first child 8 months ago. So all of this is like very, like vivid and acute kind of in the moment, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. And I think, the number one thing that kind of was most influential where I felt like I had this support is the parental leave policy that I was provided with by my employer. So I got 6 months leave, which was, it's unheard of for most people I know to have that much leave. But I found it, I recognize like how incredibly lucky I am, but it was incredibly necessary because I had a very difficult labor and I had an unexpected C-section. And so I had, a physical, medical piece that I had to recover from that I wasn't really planning or prepared to recover from. We did not have our childcare situation figured out before I gave birth, and it took the vast majority of my leave for us to figure that piece out. And if I had to go back to work at 2 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, we would not have had childcare for my son. During that time, I went through a process of, I thought I was going to exclusively breastfeed. I now am exclusively pumping, which is a very different thing. And I had to see a lactation consultant multiple times, and I was able to deal with that during the leave. In addition to like FaceTiming with one of my friends who showed me what to do, how to use a breast pump when I had to use one 2 weeks in and had no idea how to even put it together. And so I think that, there's this idea of what people are doing on their paid leave, that they're kind of like hanging out and watching TV and eating bonbons or something like that. And the reality is that I was barely functional in my mind for about 3 months. It wasn't until month 4 that I felt that I was like, kind of like, okay, now I could be a mother, like I'm actually like a functional adult and can leave the house. And so I had so many people that supported me during that time and supporting my husband and our child. But it really was that paid leave policy. And we often say at MomsRising, like the reason we need the national policy is because you shouldn't have to win the boss lottery in order to get this. A lot of people say, oh, I'm so lucky. I work for an organization that has X amount of paid leave. I work for Google and we get this much. I work for Netflix and we get this much. But it shouldn't be like a lucky thing. Like this is very necessary in order to bond with your child, in order to heal, in order to become a family, to become a parent, in order to mentally get your, ducks all in a row. And that's even if you're not dealing with, some of the mental health issues that come with having a child. For some people, that's the time that they need in order to sign up for programs like WIC or get some other government supports. And so that's definitely like the time that I felt that I had a parent nation, that I had all these people kind of supporting me on this leave. I had a policy that allowed me to do what I need to do for me and my baby and my family. And I like finally understood the thing that I had been advocating for a decade. It made sense to me finally.
It's good you got to benefit from it. But, I don't think people realize that 1 in 4 mothers go back to work 2 weeks after giving birth. I mean, 2 weeks. I mean, I don't, giving birth is a physical hit. And I'm saying that as a doctor, and then having a C-section.
I couldn't sleep in my bed at 2 weeks. I had to sleep in the guest room because our bed was too high for me to climb into. So that gives you like an idea of some of the physical things that I was dealing with. Yeah. So I certainly couldn't return to work.
Yeah, we could.
I think we're at the top of the hour. Thank you both for really an incredible conversation. There are links in the chat to both Parent Nation's website and to Moms Rising. Those links will also be in the description right below me if you're watching us on YouTube, where you can also find links to purchase Parent Nation from Literati Bookstore. Dr. Dana Suskind, Elyssa Schmier, thank you so much for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. Hope you continue to stay well, and hopefully we can have you in the store for any reason for an event sometime in the future, if not for new books. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great evening all and a great weekend. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks.